My name is Tommaso Frassetto and I will present the paper CFInsight, a comprehensive metric for CFI policies, which is the result of a collaboration between me and my colleagues at TU Darmstadt in Germany. So, despite a tremendous effort by the research community over multiple decades, memory corruption attacks are still very much dangerous, as is evidenced by the fact that 70% of the vulnerabilities Microsoft patched over a decade are memory safety issues, and as a result, they are still very much current. Let us take a closer look at how memory corruption attacks work. Here on the left, we can see the control flow graph, or CFG, of a program. In the CFG, all the nodes are basic blocks, which are sequences of instructions in the program, while the edges are the expected control flow transfers between those nodes. The most simple way to hijack the control flow of the program is to inject some new code in executable memory and then leverage a vulnerability in a block, in this case block D, to redirect the execution flow to this new code. However, since the widespread deployment of data execution prevention, or DEP, this kind of attacks is no longer possible. As a result, attackers have resorted to code reuse attacks instead, which also leverage vulnerabilities in the code, but they do not inject any additional code in the memory of the running application. Instead, they assemble the required functionality out of existing blocks of code in the application. This is the case, for example, of return-oriented programming, which is widespread in real-world attacks. Researchers have proposed a number of approaches to make those attacks harder. Those approaches use a number of techniques, including software diversity, which means, for example, code randomization, memory isolation, which include, for example, trusted execution environments, and integrity checks, including defenses like CFI and CPI. Here we will focus on CFI. But what is exactly CFI? Well, the basic idea is to find and instrument indirect function calls. Here we can see in this basic block that the address of the function to be called is computed at runtime dynamically, which means that the attacker might be able to tamper with it. The idea of CFI is then to insert a check before the call is actually performed to decide whether this call is to be allowed or not based on a CFI policy that was determined beforehand. As we have shown, CFI can be used to protect function calls and forward edges. It can also be used to protect backward edges like function returns. However, stack-specific defenses, including stack canaries and shadow stacks, are very effective ways to protect backward edges. As a result, in the remaining of this talk, we will focus on forward edge protection only. CFI, as we mentioned, embeds checks in the binary to decide whether any specific function call is to be allowed or denied from any specific indirect function call site. There are multiple ways to embed this metadata in the program. The simplest way is to fully include the list of allowed targets along with each indirect call site. This has the advantage that it is conceptually simple and precise. However, iterating through a potentially long list leads to performance slowdowns. A more pragmatic approach is to assign every node a numeric label and then only allow any specific indirect function call site to call functions with a specific label. This is simple and leads to fast checks. However, it also leads to the possibility of multiple nodes having the same numeric label, which in this case, for example, leads to the possibility of node C being able to call node D even if this function call should be prevented. This shows that label-based CFI approaches can lead to an over-approximation of the allowed edges. On a more practical level, there are a number of heuristics that can be used to assign labels to functions. The easiest way is to just assign the same label to all functions so that any of them can be called by any call site. A more advanced way is to count the number of arguments to make sure that each function call provides at least the number of arguments that are required by the target function. The most advanced heuristic in common use is to match the type signature with the one expected on the call side to make sure it matches. Given this great variety of CFI implementations available, it is important to have a metric to compare their security guarantees against each other. The most widespread metric for CFI security is AIR, or Average Indirect Target Reduction. It is defined as the average number of allowed targets at each indirect call site divided by the number of all targets available. It is easy to compute, however, it has the disadvantage that most CFI papers report AIR values greater than 99%, which means that it is hard to compare between those very similar values. Moreover, it has been shown that some CFI implementations with very high AIR values greater than 99% are still vulnerable, so even very high AIR figures are not a guarantee for good security. Metrics like AIR do not consider that attackers usually require access to a system call in order to perform tasks that are crucial to the success of the attack. Those tasks include changing memory permissions in order to inject complex pieces of malicious software inside the memory, or to interact with the file system in order to exfiltrate files or to encrypt them in search of a ransom, or any other way to further attack the operating system. In order to see why this is relevant, let us consider this example. On the left, we have an actual CFG of the program without any over-approximation. On the right, we have two CFI policies, each of which adds exactly one edge to the allowed edges. According to metrics like AIR, those two policies are indistinguishable from each other since each node has the exact same amount of outgoing edges. However, Policy 2 is much worse for security than Policy 1 because in Policy 2, the attacker can directly jump from node G to the system call, while this is not possible in Policy 1. In order to overcome this limitation, we proposed a new metric based on two observations. Our first observation is that the more nodes the attacker needs to traverse on the way to the system call, the higher it is the chance that some node will overwrite a critical register or memory location and break the attack. In this example on this slide, it is easier to start the attack in node E, which has a distance of 2 to the system call, than node A, which has a distance of 4. Our second observation is that the more paths the attacker can follow to the system call, the more likely it is that the attacker will succeed, because at least one of the paths will not have anything that breaks the attack. Considering attacks starting in node A in those two examples, it is less likely the attack will succeed in the left one, which has only two linearly independent paths, and it is more likely that the attack will succeed in the right one, which has 4 linearly independent paths. Based on our two observations, we can define block insulation, which is a metric that describes how easy it is to start an attack in a specific basic block. It is defined as the ratio between the distance of this block to a system call and the number of linearly independent paths between the block and the system call. Higher values of block insulation mean that it is comparatively harder to start an attack there, while lower values of block insulation mean that it is comparatively easier to start an attack in this block. We can define block insulation for any block that contains an indirect function call, and we can show all of those values for all of the blocks in a program in a graph, which comprehensively shows how secure a specific CFI implementation is for a program. However, we also define a single numeric metric, which is called CFI insulation, and is defined as the median of the block insulation values for all basic blocks in the program. We have more details about this construction in the paper. Our observation about system calls can also be used to construct a new policy generator. The idea is to tag every node with a distance to the closest system call. Then, anytime an indirect function call is attempted, we check whether the distance value decreases by more than 1, and if that is the case, we block it. As an example, a node with a distance of 3 can only call nodes with a distance of 2 or greater, but not a distance of 0 like in this case. This way, we prevent the attacker from taking shortcuts from the vulnerability to the closest system call. Instead, the attacker has to go through as many basic blocks as it would be necessary without violating the base CFG. We also have protected benchmarks from Spec 2017 using this scheme, and we have achieved performance overheads in the range between 1 and 2%, proving that this scheme is practical. We now consider how our new policy generator compares against other policy generators using our metric block insulation. We have analyzed a number of Spec 2017 benchmarks when protected by various CFI policies, as well as no protection at all. The graph on this slide is a cumulative distribution function of the block insulation value. We chose it because it gives a better insight about the distribution of the values across the various basic blocks rather than a single number. Curves to the left indicate worse security than curves on the right. We will now look at how specific policies compare against each other. At the moment, we see two lines. The one on the left is connected to the absence of CFI, which of course means very poor security, and that is why it is on the left. The one on the right indicates the best possible security available theoretically under our model. This line indicates the security of preventing any call except to the beginning of any function. This, unsurprisingly, gives an increase over the no security model of more than 2 orders of magnitude. If we further refine the CFI policy to only allow calls with the correct number of arguments, this further improves by 1 order of magnitude approximately. And if we also match the function type signature, the security is further improved. However, once we consider our own policy generator, we see that this is even better than all of the other policies. And finally, we combine the two best policies here, our new policy generator and the one based on function types, and we see that this improves against all of the other policies. To conclude, we have shown how existing CFI security benchmarks do not consider graph connectivity and the usefulness of system calls to the attacker. We have introduced BlockInsulation and CFInsulation, two new security metrics for CFI security based on the difficulty of reaching a system call from any basic block, which includes an indirect function call. We have also introduced NumCFI, a new policy generator for CFI that prevents the adversary from taking shortcuts to a system call. This concludes my talk. Thank you.